The recording is started.
Okay, so hello everybody. Welcome on my presentation called Layout First with CSS Grid, which is like the next part of the knowledge on the RS School program. So on the previous lectures, you already got some knowledge about basic CSS, HTML features. Last lecture was about Flexbox, and today we will be covering CSS Grid, which is like the even more sophisticated and powerful tool than Flexbox. So why I called this presentation Layout First with CSS Grid? I hope that by the end of the presentation you will know why. So basically, it should underline the main difference between the previous ways of creating a layout, like with Flexbox, and what's the difference with the CSS Grid. So let's start. Enough talking. So what's the plan of the presentation? So at the beginning, we will learn some fundamental concepts, like what CSS Grid actually is. Yeah, and basically essentials that will allow you to understand how it works. Then we will learn how to define rows, columns, tracks, how to control the behavior of the grid, how to control the sizing. There are a lot of things that are really specific and new to CSS Grid, so we will have a look at those. Then the next important topic will be template areas. So just to quick recap, so a quick hint, it's basically it's a way to create a human-friendly structure of CSS Grid. Then another important topic. So basically nowadays, most of the applications and websites are responsive, and we will check how Grid supports this responsive web design. Just like with the Flexbox, we will have a look at some basic features like centering, justifying alignment, absolute positioning, because those are pretty helpful as well. And at the end, I will try to summarize what we know about CSS Grid and maybe give you some hints about when to use it and how does it compare to Flexbox, because I can imagine that you could be a little bit, I don't know, maybe confused about when to use CSS Grid, when to use Flexbox, when to use other methods of creating a layout. So we will summarize that. Okay, so let's go back to fundamentals. So the first question that usually is asked is what exactly is CSS Grid? I saw on the previous presentation about the Flexbox that somebody asked this question on the chat. So is it a library? Is it a framework? So I thought that it would be useful to answer this question at the beginning. So basically, it's not a framework or library. This is a CSS standard defined by W3C. So here are some links, but those are really complicated technical documents usually, but of course you can have a look. And what you need in order to use CSS Grid, it's just a browser that supports its standards. So let's have a look. What can we tell about browser support? So probably you remember from the previous presentation about Flexbox. Flexbox had about as far as I remember, 98% of browser support. So CSS Grid is a bit lower, so it's 93. But yeah, so if you are targeting old versions of Internet Explorer or maybe some really exotic browsers, then you should consider not using CSS Grid. But other than that, nowadays the support is pretty good, like 94%, almost 94% is pretty good. So what's next? So the basic idea before we dive deeper into the features of the CSS Grid. So the idea is you take an element, for instance, a div element, and you make it a grid container, and then you slice and dice it into rows and columns. You then just put elements inside this container, and the magic happens. So the elements are automatically positioned into the grid, so there is no need for absolute positioning. It just happens automatically. So we will use CodePen very often to visualize the example. So what do we have here? So we have a container. If somebody could mute themselves, please. So we have a grid, we define columns and rows. We will have a look at those on the different ways of specifying columns and rows in next slides. And that's it. So that's the most basic usage of the CSS Grid. So yeah, so basically, once again, breaking it down into the steps. So you take an element, you display grid it, and then you create the columns and rows using another CSS properties. So those properties are grid template rows and grid template columns. So I guess I have a typo here. And also what is often used is a grid gap. So this is a property that lets you specify what's the distance between the columns and rows inside the grid container. The important thing about grid in general is to remember some basic vocabulary because it's repeated all over the place in the articles, in specifications. So in the grid, we have columns and rows, but usually they are called tracks. So either row or column is called a track. So you have a first column, so it's a first track vertical. So we have a first row, which is the first track horizontally. Child elements, which by default are placed in the grid, are usually referred to as grid cells. And yeah, so that's the basic vocabulary. So grids, so rows and columns are tracks, and elements inside the grid container are usually grid cells. So let's move on. So actually, this is the most basic usage of CSS Grid. So you have a container, and you don't even specify columns and rows. In this default behavior, the CSS Grid looks something similar to Flexbox. So what does it mean? If there are no tracks defined, so no columns, no rows, then by default we have one column and the rows are automatically created. Yeah, and this is basically the simplest usage. And the important thing about it is to remember yet another term to our vocabulary, which is implicit grid. So if we don't specify any columns nor rows, then we are creating an implicit grid. So grid is responsible for automatically determining the width of the column, the number of rows, the width of the rows, etc. So everything is happening automatically. Oops, sorry. Yep. So we can control this default behavior using CSS property called grid autoflow. So like I said, by default, the value is column, so sorry, row. So new rows are created for each element. So it's similar to flex direction from Flexbox. Okay. So another term to our CSS grid vocabulary is explicit grid. So when we define columns and rows using grid template columns and grid template rows properties, we are creating explicit grid. So in this basic example, so we have once again a grid container, 9 child elements, and here's the styling for it. So once again, this is a grid. We create a grid gap, which is this tiny spacing between the grid cells. We say that this grid should contain 3 columns. First one is 100 pixels, second 150, and the third one is 100 pixels once again. And we explicitly define that this grid should have 1 row. So like this area here, the first row and 3 columns are called explicit grid and explicit tracks. So what happens if we have more elements than we specified explicitly? So those elements, so like in here, we have 3 columns, we have 1 row, but we have 9 grid cells, and we have 3 rows. So second and the third row are created implicitly by the CSS grid. Way, so without columns. The grid has something extra that doesn't fit into the explicit grid, then those items are going to be styled using definitions from grid auto rows and grid auto columns. So in here we specify that extra rows will have 40 pixels. So let's have a look at the code pen. So we can, for instance, if we change that value, then we will see that the second and the third row will be much bigger. So this is sometimes useful if we have like, I don't know, a gallery of images and we don't know how many items are going to be there. So the rows are going to be added automatically. So we want to have control over what would be the width, what would be the height of the rows, for instance. Okay, so the next important thing for our CSS vocabulary is grid lines and numbering. So in CSS world, numbering in many places is often based on lines that are between the rows and columns. So it's important to remember that numbering doesn't refer to columns and rows, but to lines that are between columns and rows. And those lines specify the tracks. So for instance, if we have a line 1 and 2, vertical lines 1 and 2, then those lines, the thing which is between those lines, it's like a track. So it's important thing to remember, because those grid lines, those numbers are used very often in many places in CSS grid. And it's pretty useful when you are a beginner and either advanced developer that is using CSS grid for many months or even years, to have a good developer tool that can visualize what you have. And basically, Firefox Developer Edition is the browser which currently has the best CSS grid developer tool. Unfortunately, Chrome doesn't have like a nice visual developer tool. So if you are starting with CSS grid, I really recommend that you download Firefox Developer Edition and play around with it. So let's have a look. How does it look in the Firefox? So I already have my Firefox setup downloaded. So let's open Developer Tools. So the way it works is when you have a grid defined somewhere in your HTML, you can inspect the elements. And once you inspect the element, which is a grid container, you will have some additional options in the DevTools. So on the right, somewhere here, yeah. So we have the div container, and we can see this like a icon, which says that this is a grid. So we can click it, and suddenly we see that we have those helper. Yep.
Can you? There is a question in the chat that asking you to make font bigger in the DevTools.
Okay, cool. Thanks for hint. Unfortunately, my know how to zoom in. It doesn't work like in Chrome, like scrolling and
Control plus, maybe.
Control plus. Okay, let's keep it. Okay, it works. Thank you. Okay, I will try to open the chat window as well so I can see. The questions when they arise. Okay. Okay, so once again, so we find the element that we want to debug. So this is the container, and basically we have this checkbox here. And once this is done, we are getting some additional items in the developer tools, like display line numbers, display area names, that we will learn about areas on the next slides. And basically you can see that there are some helper lines drawn. And for instance, the important thing is that those solid lines are the borders of our explicit grid. So you can see that we have like 3 columns, 1 row. So this is the area which is explicit grid, and those dotted lines specify the implicit grid. We have line numbers. So as you can see, they start from 1. And also we have negative numbers. So we will learn about those in the upcoming slides. So I really recommend using Firefox when working with CSS grid. Okay, so CSS grid gives us a way to name those grid lines. So like you saw on the Firefox DevTool, so they start from 1 and they increase. But sometimes we have a CSS grid which is pretty large. Maybe we have many columns. So we can give those lines like a friendly names. So there is a pretty weird syntax that can be used with grid template columns and grid template rows. So you include those friendly names in the square brackets between the widths of the column. So we say that the first grid line name should be left start. Then we have a track which is 100 pixels, and after this track we should have a line which name is left end. And also the lines can have multiple names, so we can say that this line can also have name content start, and we have the next track, and we have the line which name is content end. And those friendly names can be later used in many other places on CSS Grid. We will have a look at those later. So, and one hint, so from time to time, I will try to give you some best practice advice. So if grid becomes complex, it is usually recommended to use those friendly names for grid lines or use template areas. So if you will use only those numbers, which sometimes work like magic numbers, then you can easily just get lost. Okay. So fundamentals covered. So let's have a look at the specifics of defining tracks and how the size of the tracks is being calculated by the CSS Grid. So, of course, you could start using CSS Grid just by reading one of the tutorials on the web and don't diving deeper into the internals of the algorithm that are used inside. But from my experience, if you do that, then you often will create grids that are sometimes working and sometimes some random things that you don't know how to explain are happening. So it's a good idea to have just a basic grasp of some advanced topics. And one of these topics is and what does it mean? So it means that you should imagine that you sorry if somebody could mute. Yeah, thank you. So intrinsic means that the dimensions of a box are calculated in a way like nothing else was like there was no parent element on the grid cell. So for instance, if you have a grid cell only with text, then it would have two properties. So first one is mean content. So basically this is the smallest dimension of a box, for instance, a width, that the box could shrink to using soft wrapping. So I will give you an example in a second, but basically what it means. If you have a text, then mean content is usually the length of the longest word. So that's one of the property of the intrinsic box dimensions. And the second one is max content. So this is very opposite. So this is the ideal maximal size of a box if you had an infinite available space. So basically no white space wrapping is happening and this is the max content. And it's, I think, pretty important to remember those two things, because intrinsic min content and max content is used under the hood in many places by CSS Grid. So yeah, so those properties like min content, max content are calculated by CSS Grid under the hood. So basically you don't use those really often explicitly. So it's good to know that they exist, and probably you won't be needing to, you won't need to use them very often, but let's have a look at an example, maybe that will clarify. So just to visualize things once again. So we have a parent div element, and the width of this parent element is 300 pixels. So that's the one here. And we have 3 child elements. So one of them has class max, and it means that the width is max content. So what it means that it will make the width as big as possible without doing any soft wrapping. So it doesn't care that the container that the container's width is 300 pixels. By using max content, you just say, I want to grow as much as possible. Then we have a second div, which doesn't have any additional styling, and this div is styled automatically. So it will just grow as much as the container will allow him to. And we have the third div, which has a class min, and it says width should be min content. And as you see, so basically what it means is it will shrink as much as possible, and the width is the width of the longest word in the sentence. So I think that's pretty important to remember when dealing with CSS Grid. Okay, so a little bit of advanced theory. So let's move on. So CSS Grid also has plenty of, no, maybe not plenty, but a few useful functions that help us write less code and do some advanced stuff with CSS Grid. So one of the functions that we have in our toolkit is min-max. So when specifying, oh, maybe I will, okay, let's go on. I think we should have the repeat function first, but yeah. So we have a min-max function that takes 2 arguments. The first one is the minimum length of the track, the minimum size of the track, and the maximum, and the second one is maximum size of the track. The important thing about this function is that this function is greedy. So by greedy, it means that it will try to take as much space as possible. So that's one important thing to remember about this function. And the second one is a bit tricky. So if you have those 2 arguments, min and max, and the minimum is greater than maximum, then the maximum is ignored. So that's something to remember as well. So let's have a look at the code pen. So we have a grid, 9 elements, 9 grid items. This is the function called repeat that we will cover on the next slide. So the order was wrong on the slides, but let's get down to what is important. So so the min-max function takes a range, so between 100 pixels and 200 pixels. So as you can see, if there is enough space, it will take as much as possible. If there is less space, it will shrink. Yeah, and the minimum value is 100 pixels. So that's one of the things that we can use with CSS Grid to create a responsive layout. Then there is a function called fit content, which works similar to min-max, but it's not greedy. So basically, it will try to stretch the track according to its content, but with a limited value. But the thing is that if there is a free space, it will not consume it. So it will try to take the least space needed, I would say. So yeah, so it stretches. The function is not greedy. So let's have a look at an example. So once again, container, 6 grid columns, 6 grid items, and we say that we want to have 3 columns. Each of them is fit content to 100 pixels. So maybe let's make it like, yeah. So as you can see, so basically the width of the first column was growing because we had more content to show, and the maximum width was 200 pixels, so it didn't grow more. But the other tracks, they didn't have enough content, so fit content says I don't need much space, so give me enough to show what I have. So we have only one letter here, so it doesn't take one, so it doesn't take more space. So next thing. Oh, of course, yeah, so let's have a look at one more edge case. So this is why I was trying to explain this min content and max content stuff. So when doing things with CSS Grid, always remember about how those min max functions behave. So let's say we have a content which is really long. So maybe I did even too long. So now we have a box that has a intrinsic max length, which is more than 200 pixels. So the fit content function will grow even though it exceeded the 200 pixels. So this is like something to remember, that if you have a layout and you are using the fit content, but for some reason you put a content that cannot wrap, then it can break your layout. So this is something to remember. Of course, in this case, if we replace it with min-max function, so the min-max function has a different way of resolving the maximum, so it doesn't care about the intrinsic max length, so the content will just cut. Okay, so moving on. For some reason, oh, there is a repeat function, so I don't know why, but the presentation skipped the slide. So, and there is a repeat function. So basically it's like a utility function that takes 2 arguments. So the first one is the number of columns that should be repeated. And the second one is the size of the, sorry, it's not the number of columns, it's number of tracks. So if we are using columns, we are specifying number of columns. If we are using rows, it's going to specify number of rows. So we have 4 columns in this case, and we say that each one should take some unit. In this case, it's 1 FR. We will learn about this unit later. Min-max already covered, fit content as well. Okay, so we have covered the helper functions. Now let's have a look at what kind of units can we use when defining columns. So we can use pretty much all the units that you probably know, that are pixels, percentages, relative units, units that are related to the viewport width or height. So basically, pretty much everything you can imagine. So in an example, like we say, the first column should have 100 pixels, second one 6 relative units, and the third column should be like a 10% of viewport width. And we do the same for the rows. So, and just a hint, usually best practice is to limit the usage of percentages. And this is because percentages are not taking into account the grid gap. So basically, if you have like 2 columns, the first one 50%, second one 50%, and you have a grid gap 100%, then your columns will overflow by 100%. So don't use percentages unless you really have to. Sometimes you have to, for instance, if you have other content which is outside of the grid and you would like to align the columns with something which is outside the grid, but probably that's the one of the few reasons why you should use percentages. So better stick with other units. Okay, so yet another topic which is pretty important. So free space and the way it is distributed. So first, let's define what is a free space in CSS Grid. Each grid container has a dimension, so width or height. And if we take these containers, for instance, width, we subtract the length of the explicitly sized tracks, and we subtract the gaps that are between the tracks, then we will have free space. So that's the main definition. Oops, sorry. So moving forward with the units. So one of the new things that you can find in CSS Grid is the unit or auto keyword. So what does it mean? It means that if you are using an auto, let's have a look at CSS. So basically, if you are using auto column, auto keyword inside the columns or rows, then it means that those columns should be automatically sites, but more or less it means that the column will grow as much as possible. And pretty much that's it. So in this example, let's have a look once again at the code pen. So maybe let's start with some simple content inside the grid cells. So in the pretty simple example, so we have 3 grid template columns. Each of them is auto. The content inside the grid cells is pretty much the same, so the grid container distributes the space equally. But if we have really long content, then basically we cannot say with certainty what's going to happen. So basically the grid will start to automatically calculate the width of the tracks. So in this case, those tracks with small content, like the second and the third column, are going to be really, really small, and the first one will grow. But if we start to add things into other columns, like yeah, so the second column is going to grow. So pretty much things are happening automatically for you. Yeah, so like I said, basically, so auto keyword isn't quite as robust, so it's automatic, so you have to remember about it. And if you have too little content, right, like here in the second and the third column, then the content, then the columns might take less space than you expected. But if you have the larger content, then your column might take more than you expected. So yeah, so looking basically at those definitions, you could say that we will have 3 equally sized columns, but that's not exactly true. Okay. And last thing here, so this auto keyword is pretty useful when we are combining it with other CSS grid features like fractional units, but we will have a look at it later, just keeping it in mind. So free space distribution with auto is covered. Now free space distribution with FR unit. FR unit. So let's have a look. What is this? So I think this unit is pretty unique to CSS Grid. It cannot be used anywhere else. So, sorry. Yeah. So what does it mean? So FR is this unit is used to distribute a slice of available free space to the tracks. So a few slides earlier, we defined what is the free space. As you remember, it's like a width of the grid minus explicitly sized tracks minus gaps. And what is left, this is the free space. And this FR unit allows us to distribute this space. What else should you know about it? So looking at the code snippet, it's like one of those things that I have in my cheat sheet. So one fractional, so basically you can specify, it's similar to the Flexbox. So you can specify how big slice of the free space is going to be distributed to the column. So here we say that each column should take equal slice of the free space, but you can change it to like 1, 2, 3. And it's basically, it's similar to something that you already know from Flexbox, which is FlexGrow. So it's pretty similar. But the important thing to remember is that basically what 1FR means is it's being resolved to this kind of expression. So it says that the column should take the minimum length from the auto keyword, but the maximum should be 1 fractional unit. And if you remember from the min-max slide, it can happen that the auto keyword resolves to the really, really long dimension if you have a content that cannot wrap. So as a result, it might happen that the minimum value is greater than the 1 fractional unit, and we will see what are the ramifications of it on the later slides, I guess. Yeah, but to summarize, what will happen? So let's say we have 3 grid template columns. The first one is 100 pixels. The second one is 1 fractional unit. The third one is 2 fractional units. And provided that we have a grid which is 400 pixels wide, and the grid gap is 0. The math is pretty easy. So we have 300 pixels of a free space. And then this 300 pixels is being distributed between the second and the third column. And as a result, we have a first column, which is fixed size, which is 100 pixels. Second one received 1/3 of 300 pixels, and the last one received 2/3, which is 200 pixels. So this is how you can distribute free space between the columns. Okay, so here's the demo. So let's have a look. So once again, container, 9 grid, 9 cell items. And we say that like first column is 100 pixels, second one 50 pixels, and the first one is 1 fractional unit. So basically, provided that we have 600 pixels container, it will take the rest. But if we change it to 1 FR, then we will see that the space is going to be distributed equally. What is going on? Oh yeah, it didn't refresh. So you see that the first column is 100 pixels and the second one and the third one are divided equally. And we can do the same with row height. The important thing about row heights is that grid must have an explicit height because otherwise there is no free space. So height of the grid container 1000 pixels. Yes, so the first row is still fixed size, and the second and the third one are taking the rest of this free space equally. Okay, let's move on. So now that we know more and more about the CSS grid, let's imagine that we want to create a layout with 3 columns that are equally sized, so they have the same width. So at first glance, you might say that I want to create a grid template columns with this definition, so 3 times 1 FR repeated. So it indeed will create 3 equal tracks, but not in all the cases. So just a reminder, because this is important. So FR and auto columns, they are checking their child element sizes first. So they will internally under the hood, the CSS grid is going to compute the min content and max content for each cell. And depending on the size, it will make a decision. So if the min content, so like in here, I will show it in a code pen in a second. If the content of the CSS grid cell is really big and cannot be wrapped, then as you remember, 1 FR means min max. The first argument is auto and the second one is FR. So the auto will be bigger than 1 FR. So 1 FR is going to be ignored and we will have a really, really long column. It's not exactly what we expected. So that's right. So how to solve this issue, which probably you will deal with it really often. So that's the example. So we have columns and we say, please take the free space equally, but as we can see, it doesn't happen like this. So there is a fix for it. And basically this is, so because we know that 1 FR means min max auto 1 FR. So basically what we can do, we can change the value of the first argument. So if we do something like this, so grid template columns, min max 0, 1 FR, then we are saying 1 FR, this is totally the max that can be given to this track and nothing more. Of course, we will have the overflow issues with that, but we can deal with it in a different ways. But basically, so this is the way to create like equally spaced columns or rows. So pretty common thing that you will do in your developer life. So moving forward, so as we already know, so FR and auto grid columns tracks, they are checking their child elements first. And one more thing that is worth to consider is how they compare to percentages, which are actually discouraged to use, but from time to time you will need it. So this is pretty much the same grid repeated 3 times. So the first grid is using percentages to define columns, so 33% 3 times. So those percentages are fixed sized, so nothing will touch them. So it's like written in stone. The auto columns, like we saw on the previous slides, the first one will grow, and the second and the first one is going to be as small as possible. And fractional units, it's also not going to behave the way we wanted because we have a really long space. So it's also important to remember how those 3 things like fractional unit, auto, and percentages compare to each other. So probably you have enough of FR and auto units by the time, but there are still, I think, 1 or 2 slides about those units and interesting use cases. So what will happen if you have a fractional unit and auto keyword used together? So basically the thing is that the easiest definition of what is happening is that fractional units are winning the fight for the remaining space. And this is also pretty useful. I think you can use it in your homework, I guess, because it's pretty useful in defining your layouts. So like here in the example, so we have 3 columns. The first one is auto, second one is fractional unit, and the last one is auto. And what is happening, like fractional unit is winning the fight for the free space. So the left and the right sidebar is going to be smaller, and everything which is left is going to be assigned to the middle main content column. Of course, you can mix it with other functions like min-max, and you can, because like right now, if you go to the code pen and we start shrinking, the left and right sidebar are sometimes really small. So you can add min-max definitions to the first and last column, and you can say that you don't want your sidebar to be, for instance, smaller than 200 pixels. So this is an example of how things can be, all those features that CSS Grid provides you can be combined together. Yeah, so pretty much summary. So I think everything is covered. Just remember about this formula, like min-max 1 FR is min-max 1 auto FR. And if you want to ignore the automatic computation, then override it with 0. I think I use it very often. So far we saw that we had defined rows and columns, and they were automatically placed inside the grid container. And now we will have a look how we can change the default place where those are being positioned. So like I said, by default, if grid container sees elements inside it, then it will put it in the first available space, which is the first cell. But this behavior can be changed. So yeah. So we have two new CSS properties. The first one is a grid column, which is a shorthand for grid column start and grid column end, and the second one is grid row, which is short for grid column, grid row start and grid row end. I have a bug, but let's move on. And what's the syntax? So basically, as you might spot it, so sometimes the syntax in CSS Grid is pretty weird. So it's not different when in this case. So you specify a grid column or a grid row, and it has a syntax like the first value is start, then slash, and the second one is stop. And basically the start and stop, those are line numbers or line names. So like this is one of the places where you start using line numbers. So this is why it was important to understand how they are created. There is also additional keyword, so something which you will probably usually do, often do, is spanning. So for instance, you will want to say that the grid, that the element inside the grid should take like 2 columns. So there is an easy way to specify that. You say grid column, span, and the number of, in this case, columns that it should take. It works the same for grid row. You would say grid column span 2, and it will take two rows. Yeah, so some specific is that if the number of columns or rows is greater than the defined columns, then the implicit columns or rows are created. So this is something to remember, that basically it's not going to break your grid, but it will create an implicit content. And here is the example. So yeah, so here we say that we want to span 2 columns. In this case, we say that the column should start at 5th line, and it should span 2 lines backwards. In the third example, so it says that the column should start from the first line and end at 5th line. And this is where we see something new. So if you recall on this Firefox DevTools slide, we saw that there are negative numbers. So basically, CSS Grid by default creates many names for the lines. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. For instance, you can provide your own names, but it also gives you a negative numbers, which are counted from the end of the grid. So in this case, we say that the column should start at the first column, and it should end at the last one. So it's a really easy way to say that, in this case, take the whole row. And the best practice advice, so try to use negative numbers. So if you are creating a layout with CSS Grid and you know that something should take the whole row, don't use, for instance, 1/5, because if in the future you will change the number of columns, then you will need to change it in 2 places. If you have 1/-1, it will be bulletproof. Of course, depends on the use case, but basically it's pretty useful to use those negative numbers. Apart from reordering with grid row and grid column, there is a property, I think it's the same with the Flexbox, it's called order. So basically you can target the grid item and say where it should be placed. So for instance, in our case, once again, we have like a six items in the grid. And we want to say that take the nth child, which is like the sixth child, so this guy, and put it at the very beginning. Take the fifth child, this is the order in the DOM, and make it order 2. And important thing to remember is that when you start ordering, you need to start ordering all the items. So this is why I initially set the order for all the children in the container to 3, and then I just override those two guys. Yeah, but the best practice is not to use it. So it's going to be covered on one of the last slides, but basically changing the order, it's only changing the order visually, so it doesn't change the order in the source code. And as a result, it might break the accessibility and text selection. So I think we will see it here. So basically, I can select 1, 2, 3, 4, but I won't be able to do this kind of selection. You see that basically 5 is in the source code is after those other elements. So it's impossible to select it. It's also even impossible to select it this way, but I should be able to select, yeah, so it's completely broken. So if you have a feature that you might think that users will use text selections, or I don't know, maybe using tabs, then consider not using the order. So another thing is that grid column and grid row might have a side effects, which is called by some people dead spots. So when you use grid column and grid row to place the items, they can create dead spots. And why is that? So basically, if the grid is seeing an element that cannot fit into the column, into the track, it will move it to the next track. So if we have a look here, so we have 12 items, and I have a selector. So just maybe let's remove it for a second and see that by default, everything is laid nicely. But what I say that every third element should span 3 columns. So we have first, second, and the third one. And this third one takes 1, 2, 3 columns. And then once again, 4, 5, and 6 takes the 3 columns. And because this third item, there is not enough space to put it in the first track, it's going to be put later. So those are called dead spots, and Grid has a solution for that with Grid Auto Flow property. If you set it to dense, it will enable the algorithm that will try its best to organize cells in a way that minimizes the number of those dead spots. So let's have a look. So we have dead spots, and we don't. So that's something that can be useful in some situations as well. But of course, the best practice, just like in the with the order property, try not to use it or use it with caution, because it has the same consequences. It breaks the accessibility and text selection. It's also true for the Flexbox. So Flexbox also gives you this way of, for instance, reversing the order. of the items. So it will also have the same consequences. So please keep it in mind. Okay, so template areas. Just give me a second. Yeah. So what are the template areas? So those are ways to define areas of the grid using friendly names that are easy to remember and just give you a quick information about what is going on in the grid. So, and this is one of the places where I will just underline it. When you have something to be designed in CSS, HTML, just think about the layout first. So, for instance, you have a page and you have this design that there should be a title, there should be a main content, there should be a left sidebar, right sidebar, there should be a footer. So maybe take a piece of paper, write it down, and you will see some patterns. And basically, grid template areas gives you a syntax to define it in a human, like more readable way, using textual, like English words, for instance. So there are two steps that you need to do. So the first thing is you define grid template areas using grid template areas keyword. So the syntax is, as usual with CSS Grid, pretty weird. So multi-line definition. So you say that the first row is divided into 3 columns, and all of them are called title. The virtual second row has a left area on the left, there is a content in the middle, and there is a right on the right. Probably it should be named slightly differently. And the last row is reserved for the footer. So that's the first thing. And then we have elements. So we have a container, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 elements. And we say that element number 1, please go to the title area. So it will go here. And as you can see, we have a first element with the string 1 goes to the first row and it spans all the 3 columns. Then we have a second element and we say, please go to the area left. And it goes here. Then there's the content, goes in the middle, and so on and so on. So this is pretty useful when you have something that can be like a named in a more like I don't know, human readable way, right? So you go into the CSS, you have template areas, and you see what's going on instead of magic numbers. One extra thing that you get when using template areas is that CSS Grid automatically creates grid lines with the same name as the area. So if we define an area which is called title, we will have title start and title end grid lines. So this is something that also can be used, and this is like an extra feature. So basically, this title start, title end is the same like grid column 2/3. But yeah, when you read it like title start and title end, then you go here and you can see, oh, so this element goes here. So it's also pretty useful. So with template areas, it's very easy to modify the layout of your page. So of course, you need to use media queries. I don't know if that was covered, but let's have a look. So let's say this is our base layout. So once again, we have a left sidebar, right sidebar, title, content, and footer. And at some point, we decide that our layout should be responsive. And we say that if the size of the viewport drops under 500 pixels, we want to change the layout completely. So now we say that our container should have only one column and three areas, which is title, content, and the footer. And we hide left and right sidebar. So I think this code pen is not interactive here. But if we go here, you can see that, yeah, so maybe let's make it slightly bigger so you can see the result. Oh, code pen, please refresh. Ah, I modified the wrong spot. It should be here. Yeah. So we say our first column is 100 pixels. Then there is a fractional unit and 100 pixels once again. But if we shrink it and we use it on our smartphone, for instance, then we will see only one column, which is defined, which is redefined here. So pretty useful stuff. Okay, so let's move on to the next. Yeah, so template areas covered. So next topic, responsive grid. So from this chapter, you should remember three keywords: repeat function, which you already know, and two new things, which is autofill and autofit. So let's have a look at what is this. But before we dive in, so just a reminder about the responsive layout, what it is. So it's an approach to a web design that enables you to render web pages in a different way depending on the devices you are using, the size of the windows, etc. And the way to figure out those differences, you need to use media queries. So media queries are pretty powerful. So you can query the browser for the size of the viewport. You can query about for the orientation, whether you are using your smartphone in a portrait or landscape mode. You can even query about what touch devices you are using, whether it's a mouse or something else. So it's more powerful than you expect, probably. So so before Flexbox and CSS Grid was introduced, we had to use media queries all over the place. That was the only way to modify how the layout was rendered. But the Flexbox and CSS Grid were created after this responsive boom was already in place. So most of the behaviors of Flexbox and CSS Grid are designed in a way that are responsive. So as a result, you don't need to use media queries as often as in the past. And one thing that definitely shows why CSS and Grid and Flexbox are better. Media queries generally, like not generally, but they work in the context of the screen size. So you can query, you can use media queries to create a breakpoints based on the viewport width, but Flexbox and CSS Grid are working in the context of the container. So this is pretty useful. Let's see it in action. So basically, let me just fall down the JavaScript. So we have the same structure here. So we have an image and we have a text, and basically what it shows us that we don't have any media query defined here. This is an example using Flexbox because it was like more valid for this case. And we say that each element inside our media container, which is here. So this is media container. We have an image and text inside it. We say that those are Flexbox item with ideal width of 250 pixels. So, and Flexbox and CSS Grid works in the same way. They see that there is not enough space inside the container to fit those both items next to each other. So it will wrap it. Whereas in this case, we are not using any container, so it will shrink. So it's not something that we would expect. And yeah, so this is important to remember that you don't need to use media queries with Flexbox and CSS Grid to have this kind of responsive behavior. So the bottom line, best practice, try to design things without breakpoints, without media queries. Of course, sometimes you have to, just like we saw with those grid areas, but very often it's just not needed. So, and we have two keywords, autofill and autofit. And this is where the magic happens. So basically, those two keywords are used together with the repeat function. So as the first argument, instead of fixed value of number of columns, you specify, I want to autofill or autofit the columns. And the second argument is the expression that specifies the size of the column in our case. And there is a really subtle difference between the autofill and autofit. It's like a really hard to explain. So I will just make a demo. So I think you can just read the details, but probably it's going to be easier to demonstrate with an example. Okay, let me have a look what's going on here. So what is the first one? Autofill. Okay, so maybe let's comment those out easier. Okay, so we have a grid container and we specify that we want to have like a infinite number of columns, and each of the columns should have 150 pixels. So what it will do, it will behave somewhat similar to Flexbox, but not exactly. So if there is enough space inside the track, which is 150 pixels, it will move the items into the columns. So as you can see, if there is not enough space, it will just move them. Yeah, so that's the first example of responsive behavior. Then we have container 2. So what is happening in container 2? So we say that we want to, once again, autofit. And then we say that our columns should take between one fractional size and between 150 pixels and one fractional size. So in this case, we don't have a fixed value. So as you can see, if we have enough space, the fractional units kick in, so the columns will grow. But if there is not enough space for each item to be 150 pixels, the items will go to the next column. Okay. And now the difference between autofill and autofit. So the difference is really subtle. So it changes the way how grid gives space to grid items. If there is more space than there are grid items, I would say. So let's have a look. So initially they behave in the same way. So as you can see, things are growing. But if there is more space and the virtual next column could be put here, so there is 150 pixels available, then autofit will not put this column here, but it will divide this space to the existing columns. But autofill will just insert this guy here, but it won't share this available space to existing columns. So this is one subtle difference. I cannot think of any usages of it, but this is something to keep in mind when you are using repeat with auto columns. But the bottom line is that this is the way to achieve the responsive behavior. So there is a live coding exercise, but I think let's try to do it at the end if we have time. So let's proceed. Centering, justifying, alignment, and absolute positioning. So this is something that most of the Flexbox presentation was about. So how you can justify items around. So the same kind of features are available in CSS Grid, so I won't spend too much time on explaining those because pretty much they work in the similar way. So you have two categories of keywords. This is how I used to remember it, and it's slightly easier to remember than in Flexbox, because in Flexbox you can change directions, but in CSS Grid this is as easy as I will explain now. So justify properties are working on horizontal axis, so for columns, whereas align keywords are working on the vertical axis. And I think Flexbox has the same properties, so you can justify items, you can justify content, you can justify self. So just remember, justify is for columns, aligning is for rows. So let's have a look. So I created a simple container, grid container, added 9 grid items to it, and let's see what will happen. So by default, the content is stretched, but if we start using those properties, so justify start, I love this. Why it's not refreshing? Yeah, now it refreshed. So justify start. So we are working on this axis. So it says that the content should be justified to the beginning of each cell. If we use align items, then we are working on a vertical axis. So now we say that each element should be justified to the beginning of the column and to the beginning of the row cell. So this is why this is top right corner. If we do and we will have it in the other corners. If we do center, then we will have things perfectly centered. Pretty much the same stuff as in the Flexbox. So that's something that they share in common. Okay, let's go next. So you can also use position absolute. The reason why I mention it is that sometimes this is useful if you want to overlap elements inside grid container. So what are the use cases? So sometimes you have an image gallery. If we have time, we will do the coding exercise. We will do an image gallery. So you might have an effect that if you hover over the element, you want to show like an overlay. So this is like a use case for position absolute. And also, this is something that I used in my previous example. So by default, CSS Grid doesn't give you a way to specify the gutter background color. So instead of that, you can position absolutely an element inside the grid and tell him to take whole content. So I think we can have a look. So as you can see, there is this background element. So I say, I want to position it absolutely. It should start with the first. Yeah, so probably I could use the best practice and use the negative numbers here. Yeah, so I say take all the rows, take all the columns. Width and height is maximum is needed because we use position absolute, and we specify the background color. So this is why we have this red background color. If we just remove this position absolute, then yeah, this guy is going to be positioned first because we have explicit grid row, grid column stuff, and the others are just unfortunately kicked out of the explicit grid. But yeah, so keeping in mind that you can position grid items absolutely as well. The alternative way of doing the same thing is to create, is to make a grid item, the things that are in the grid cells, which is grid item. You can also make it a grid container with the size of 1 column and 1 row, and you can place 2 items in the same column and row, and basically you can grid supports this, and you can just create the similar effects like overlays. So basically the hint is that for the bigger grids, probably you would like to use the absolute positioning, because if you start using grid column and grid row, then you would need to position elements inside the grid. Then you would need to position all elements in the grid. Okay, so live coding image gallery, I think that's gonna be pretty quick. So that's an example I was talking about. So that's the final result. So let's just get rid of the CSS. So, and we will try to code it. From scratch. So let's say we want to create a gallery. So this is our basic HTML structure. We have a container. We have items that are grouping the image, and a button that will, I don't know, for instance, go to the details or show like an image in the bigger resolution or whatever. And we want to make it a gallery. So the first thing we need to do is to specify a grid container. So we address the main div. We say display grid, but nothing changes. This is because the automatic rows are created, so we need to create columns and rows explicitly. So we want to say in our final result we had 3 columns, so let's make it 3. So grid template columns and repeat 3 times 150 pixels. So it's already looking pretty good. But let's say we also wanna make those grid items rectangular. So let's make template rows also repeat this guy. So now you can see like we have our buttons overflow, but we will fix that later. And also let's give it a grid gap. Make it only at 10 pixels, so we have just a subtle spacing. And please refresh. Okay, maybe 10 pixels is not enough. 20. Is there something that I'm doing wrong? Grid. Oh, there's a typo. Okay, so now we want to create this effect that when we hover over the image, we want to show the button. So we can do it in 2 ways. So we can absolutely position the buttons, but I will take the second approach. So we will make each of these divs inside the container, those direct children, I will make it a grid container as well. So there is nothing wrong with making a grid item a grid container as well. So grid container div, and I say I want to be a grid container. And what else can we do? So it's going to be grid container with 1 column and 1 row. So I will just name it with a grid template area. So grid template area, and I will give it a name, just content. Nothing changes so far. And what I wanted, I think that's enough for the time being. Okay, so what can we do next? So we have 2 items. So now those divs are grid containers as well. So we want to position both image and button on the grid container. So we say container div. I will use asterisk to make it shorter, and I say that grid area should be content. So now we can see that both items were placed in the same area and they overlap. So let's make this button stretch. So I can do it like container div button, and let's say justify. Oh, we want to do it here. So we want to say justify items and justify content stretch as well. Okay, so just so for some reason why the images are being stretched.
You have a typo there. It's second stretch without second T.
Thank you. But it didn't help. It didn't help as well. Okay, let's go back to it later, maybe. I will try to do it with a button, maybe. Okay, so we have this guy, but we want to have this effect that we show the button only when we hover over the image. So what we can do is we can just address the button. We can style it a bit, like, I don't know, text transform per case. Let's say like color white, background. Like this, okay. And we don't want a border. That's it. Okay, and the thing is that initially we don't want to see it, so we can do transform, translate Y, 100%. But yeah, so this guy won't work. Oh, finally. Yeah. And I think the second one was not needed because it was already full width. Okay, so what we did is we just moved the button from the container, but we still see it. So we need to do overflow hidden. So button is outside. So now we need an effect that if we hover over the image, then we will show the button. So container, direct child, hover, hover button, and we want to say transform, translate. So let's see how it goes. Yeah, so now it shows. We can also add with transition 0. So now we have this nice cool effect that when we hover over, we see the items. So the bottom line from this exercise is that you can have nested grid containers, and you can have as many as you like grid containers inside the single grid cells. So one thing to notice is, oh, maybe I think that will be enough. So that's something to remember. Let's go to the last chapter, which is Flexbox comparison. So probably now you have a big picture over how to use CSS Grid and what Flexbox is from the previous presentation. So let's just summarize things that we know. So usually people ask themselves, so CSS Grid was added after the Flexbox, so is it a replacement? Is it something better? So the answer is no. They are designed to do slightly different things. and they work together pretty nicely. So there are some things that can be done with the grid, and Flexbox can't do them, and other way around. So when designing your layouts, use both. So we will summarize when Flexbox is a better choice and when CSS Grid is a better choice. So don't stick to only CSS Grid or only Flexbox, mix them around. Yeah, so for instance, this is something that for many years I used to do with Flexbox, so creating toolbars. So, and also this is a nice example of content first approach, which is implemented with Flexbox, and layout first approach that is at the fundamentals of CSS Grid. So for instance, if you want to create a toolbar, so usually you have the navigation, maybe some kind of inputs with search capabilities, and on the right side you have some text content on the logout button. So it's extremely easy to create this kind of behavior with Flexbox. You just make a container, a Flexbox container, and you say that the last item on the right should have an automatic margin left, and everything works nicely. So Flexbox with Flexbox was designed to make the best possible flexible layout for you without doing anything else by you. So very rarely you need to do anything else. So it will try to automatically compute the widths of the element and so on. So this is pretty easy. But if you can do the same thing with CSS Grid. So you have a header, you make it a grid container, and you specify that you want 4 columns which are automatic. So the first column will be for home link, second one for blog link, third one for about link, and the fourth one for search bar, for search input. And you say that the last column is fractional units, and you will put, for instance, a logout button here. And yeah, so you remember that if there is an auto column and fractional units wins the fight for the free space. So this is why this guy is going to be put on the left. So as you can see, both specifications allow you to do the same thing, but Flexbox is better because it's more flexible. So imagine you add new navigation items to the toolbar. So with Flexbox, you don't need to do anything. With CSS Grid, you would need to go to the style sheet and change it to 5-column layout, for instance, to repeat 5 if you add additional items. So there are cases when Flexbox is just a better, simple, more flexible approach. So more comparison details. So because Flexbox was implemented by many browsers at different times, it might happen that like old versions of Chrome or Firefox, they have a Flexbox implementation with slight bugs. So this is something that Flexbox is slightly worse than Grid. If you have something that needs better animation support, then you should probably use Flexbox. So with Flexbox, you can animate widths, heights, pretty much everything. As far as I remember, CSS Grid doesn't have too many properties that can be animated with transition, for instance. There is something wrong with my animations. On the other hand, Grid has a really good consistency between the vendors a few years ago, pretty much at the same time. So if browser supports Grid layout, then you can be pretty sure you won't run to some slight bugs or differences in the behavior. So there are things that Flexbox can do and Grid cannot do. So this is, for instance, reversing the order of items. Yeah, so easier to create toolbar layouts. This is something that Flexbox excels at. Yeah, so pretty common thing that you do on daily basis is perfectly centered elements, equally easy with Flexbox and CSS Grid, and variable widths on each row. So this is something to keep in mind when you make a decision whether to use Flexbox or Grid. So with Flexbox, each row or each column, depending on the direction, can have different widths of next columns or next rows. So they are not tightly coupled. With Grid, all the columns must have the same width, all rows must have the same height. Oh, sorry. It's not true for rows, but for columns, yes. And yeah, one last thing, if you are picky about performance, so usually it's better to create an overall layout of the page with CSS Grid because it handles rendering in a progressive way, in a faster way. And so you can check those two articles if you are interested, and you will see the difference. So for general layout, like making header, sidebar, footer, it's better to use the CSS Grid. Yeah, and that's the thing that I was trying to explain. So with Flexbox, you can do this thing which is on the lower image. So each row can wrap to the next row, and items can be flexible, so the columns don't align. So this is something, if you see this kind of layout, basically it cannot be achieved with CSS Grid. So please use Flexbox layout. But if things are aligned nicely in the columns, so now you see like the third row spans two columns, but they are still aligned, then this is the case for CSS Grid. And also sometimes people just say, hey, there is a CSS Grid framework. What is this? So those are different things. So in the past, we didn't have CSS Grid, we didn't have Flex Layout. So when doing page layouts that were flexible, that were responsive, you had to do manual math, you had to use floats, percentages. So there was some math involved. So this is why popular CSS frameworks like Bootstrap, Semantic UI, and other, they have their own grid systems because it was just easy to import the Bootstrap and use the grid system. But right now, I would encourage you to use those CSS frameworks only for their components. But if you have a grid layout to implement, like a table or something, then try to use CSS Grid on your own. The one thing I don't personally like about those CSS frameworks is that each of them has their own naming conventions. So Bootstrap has col SM, whatever. Semantic UI has other naming conventions. So each framework is different. But CSS Grid, this is one specification. It's written in stone. So once you learn all those grid template columns, areas, and stuff, you will know it. Yeah. So till the end, I would say. And probably, so you didn't have accessibility presentation yet, but as far as I remember, it's somewhere on the agenda. So please remember that there are features both in Flexbox and CSS Grid that are breaking accessibility support. So if you reorder things, you use grid autoflow dense, so you might end up with worse support for like disabled people. So screen readers are always checking what's inside the source code. So if you change the layout significantly with those reordering techniques, so the screen reader will just freak out. And the same with, for instance, using tab for navigation between links. So please use those features with caution. Also, a few words about other unsupported IE and other unsupported browsers. So unless you really are creating an application that needs this kind of support, you shouldn't be concerned. Usually IE 11 is used in enterprises for some kind of internal applications. So sometimes you see this browser in statistics, but yeah, so like I said, it's usually in enterprises. I don't know, my mother has a shop and he has a really old computer with Windows 98 or something, and she has IE. So yeah, so once in a while she will hit the Google and yeah, you will see the statistics that somebody is using IE 11. And also if you are not targeting applications that are being used in developing countries, like somewhere in the Asia, you shouldn't be concerned about the awkward mobile browsers. So if we have a look at the CSS, can I use CSS grid? So there is this feature here. How can I add global usage? There was an option here to add for sure there was a apply filters. Yeah, so last time I checked, so for instance, CSS has a support 95%, but I was in the Vietnam last year, and just out of curiosity, I checked what's the support in Vietnam, and it was like 70%, because in Vietnam, many users are using this UC browser for Android. I don't know why. So unless you have like a requirement that your application is going to be used in Vietnam, yeah, so don't bother about those browsers probably. And also from time to time, you will see this display subgrid feature. This is definitely something that you shouldn't be using. This is a next version of specification, and it's not implemented in the browsers yet, I think, except Chrome. I think we are running out of time, so please check those 3 pages. They are really good examples of using CSS grid together with Flex. So you will see that, for instance, toolbars are being made using Flexbox, and the general grid layout is done using CSS grid. Yeah, and as for usages of CSS grid, so image galleries, simple blocks, toolbars, although Flexbox is more often used. So if you have components like a calendar, slider, overlay, or games, Monopoly, so something that has a layout that you can think of, like calendar, it's like cells and rows and columns, so consider using CSS grid. Also things like albums, movies, products, catalogs in shops. This is something that perfectly suits CSS grid features. And also, like some of the applications on the web, like CodePen, JS Fiddle, they are using CSS grid. Yeah, and responsive websites, making whole page layout already covered. And yeah, so sometimes, like I said, try not to use grid systems from CSS libraries. Try to use your own. Okay, so I guess that's it. So almost 2 hours. Sorry for being for talking so much. I just wanted to share my experience. Also, I wanted to show you, I think we don't have enough time for the second live coding example, but this is something that I wanted to do with you. So pretty easy to achieve CodePen application. So I don't know, with 55 lines, even less because of the comments. Yeah, you can go through total chaos to an application which is looking pretty much like CodePen that we were using. So thanks a lot. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will find the knowledge useful and use it inside your homework from this lecture. So thanks a lot for attendance.
Thank you, Pavel. Definitely it was amazing lecture, and I guess it was useful